The morning Elias Cade walked into the Red Bluff Saloon with enough gold dust in his saddlebag to buy half of Sweetwater Creek, nobody expected him to spend every last grain of it clearing the debts of a woman he had never spoken more than 10 words to in his life. It was the autumn of 1873, and the town of Sweetwater Creek, nestled in the sun-baked flats of southwestern Texas, was the kind of place that chewed men up and spat out their bones before noon. The main street was a ribbon of cracked earth, the buildings warped and sun-bleached, and the people who lived there wore the same expression, somewhere between resignation and quiet endurance. A dry wind rolled in from the hill country most mornings, carrying with it the smell of cedar and hot dust, and by the time the afternoon settled its weight over the rooftops, even the horses in the livery looked like they were reconsidering their life choices. Elias had come down from the Guadalupe Mountains 3 days before. He came down only twice a year, once in the spring for supplies and once in the fall to trade his season's worth of furs and smoked game. He was not a man who sought company easily, nor one who carried a reputation built on words. His reputation was built on the kind of things people saw with their own eyes and remembered for years afterward. He stood 2 inches over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the doorframe of the saloon look like it had been built specifically as a frame around him. His arms were the arms of a man who had felled timber alone, who had dragged elk carcasses down mountain ridges in the dead of winter, who had built his own cabin with his own 2 hands over the course of one brutal summer. His hair was dark brown and fell past his collar, longer than most men wore it in town, and his jaw was always carrying at least a week of dark beard. His eyes were a steady, quiet gray, the kind that didn't startle easily and didn't look away when something needed to be faced. He came to Sweetwater Creek for supplies. He stayed because of what he saw when he stepped through the saloon doors. The Red Bluff Saloon was run by a man named Gerald Potts, a wide, greasy individual with small eyes and an even smaller conscience. It was the kind of establishment where the whiskey was watered down, but the prices were not, where the card games had a way of always tilting toward the house, and where Gerald Potts had made himself a quiet empire of debt over the better part of a decade. He lent money to men who had none, and then he collected it in ways that left a man with less than he had started with. Elias stepped through the batwing doors just after midday and took a position at the far end of the bar, setting down his coin for a glass of whatever passed for whiskey, and he watched. There was a woman behind the bar, not Gerald Potts, who was seated at a corner table playing cards with 2 men who looked like they had been born in a saddle. The woman was wiping glasses with a cloth that had seen better days, and she was doing it with the kind of mechanical focus that a person develops when they are trying very hard not to think about something. She was perhaps 27 or 28, with dark auburn hair that she wore pinned back at the neck, a few strands of it coming loose across her cheek from the heat of the room. She was not dressed in the manner of the saloon girls who moved between the tables taking orders. She wore a plain cotton dress the color of dust, and there was nothing theatrical about her in the least. She had the look of a woman who worked, who had always worked, and who expected to go on working without comment or recognition until the work killed her. Her name, Elias would learn in the next 5 minutes, was Clara Whitmore. Down the way? That's the widow, said the barman beside him, a lean, older man named Hector who poured drinks when Gerald Potts couldn't be bothered. Mrs. Clara Whitmore, her husband passed about 2 years back. Thomas Whitmore had himself a little homestead east of town, got kicked by a horse and didn't come back from it. Elias said nothing, but he didn't stop watching. Gerald bought out her husband's debt the day after the funeral, Hector went on, his voice dropping just enough that it wouldn't carry. She couldn't pay it off and keep the homestead both, so she gave up the homestead. Works here now to pay down what Gerald says she owes. Problem is, what she owes keeps growing. Gerald's got a habit of adding to the ledger. New interest, new charges, charges for using the room upstairs, charges for her meals. Man's been bleeding her for 2 years and she's barely made a dent. How much does she owe? Elias asked. Hector cut him a sideways look. Why? How much? Elias asked again, and there was something in his voice, not threatening, not loud, just absolutely settled, that made Hector answer without any further debate. Last I heard Gerald tell it to someone, somewhere close to $240. Could be more by now, way he keeps adding to it. Elias picked up his whiskey glass and looked at it for a moment without drinking from it. Then he set it back down on the bar. "Where does Potts keep his ledger?" he asked. Hector blinked. "Behind the bar, that locked box under the shelf there." Elias nodded slowly. He turned and looked at the room for a long moment. He watched Clara Whitmore set down one glass and pick up another, and he watched the way she kept her eyes down when one of the card players said something to her that was not fit to be repeated, and the way she breathed through it, the way a person breathes through pain, just kept moving, kept the face composed, kept working. He put down another coin on the bar and asked Hector to let Gerald Potts know he had a business matter to discuss. Hector went to do it with the look of a man who wasn't sure if he was setting something in motion or stopping something from happening, and perhaps he wasn't entirely sure which outcome he was hoping for. Gerald Potts came to the bar with the shuffle of a man who was comfortable in his own territory and liked other people to feel slightly less comfortable in it. He had a gold watch chain that he touched whenever he was considering money, which was most of the time. "Hector says you got business," Gerald said. "I do," Elias said. "I want to buy Clara Whitmore's debt, all of it, whatever it totals, whatever interest you've applied, whatever charges are in that ledger. I want to buy the whole thing today, and I want a receipt and her released from any obligation she has in this establishment." Gerald Potts looked at Elias the way a person looks at something unusual that has appeared in a place they did not expect to find it. Then he laughed, a short, flat sound that wasn't particularly convincing. "Well now," Gerald said, "that's a funny thing to want. What business is the widow's debt to you?" "Name your price," Elias said. Gerald looked him over, the size of him, the stillness of him, and something cautious moved behind his small eyes. He did some arithmetic in his head that was probably more favorable to himself than any honest count would allow, and he named a figure of $300. Elias did not flinch, did not bargain, did not argue. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and brought out a leather pouch and set it on the bar without ceremony, and the sound it made when it landed was the sound of a significant amount of gold dust. "You'll write out a full receipt," Elias said. "Her name, your name, a statement that the debt is cleared and she owes nothing to this establishment, every charge, and you'll give me the ledger page." Gerald Potts was quiet for a moment that stretched considerably. He touched his watch chain. "320, he said, testing. "I said name your price and you named it," Elias said, and his voice had not changed in volume or temperature even slightly. "300, now." Gerald took the gold dust. The saloon had gotten quieter in the way that saloons do when something worth watching is happening, and Clara Whitmore had stopped wiping glasses. She was standing very still at the far end of the bar, the cloth in her hands, and she was watching Elias Cade and Gerald Potts with an expression that had not yet decided what it was feeling. Gerald wrote out the receipt at the bar with a pen that scratched and blotched, and he signed it and tore the relevant page from the ledger with considerably less grace than the situation required, and he handed both across to Elias. Elias looked them over, folded them carefully, and tucked them inside his coat. Then he picked up his whiskey glass, took a single drink from it, set it back down, and walked to the end of the bar where Clara Whitmore was standing. She watched him come. She was not a small woman. She had a good height to her, and she stood straight with the posture of someone who had decided early in life that she was not going to make herself smaller for anybody. But she had to look up at him when he stopped in front of her, and something flickered across her face that was not quite fear and not quite hope, but lived somewhere in the territory between them. He set the receipt and the ledger page on the bar in front of her. "These are yours," he said. "You don't owe anything to Gerald Potts or this establishment. Your debt is cleared." Clara looked down at the papers. She looked up at him. A small, complicated series of emotions crossed her face in quick succession. Disbelief first, then a sharp suspicion, because a woman in her position had long since learned that nothing was given without something being taken in return. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was quieter than he expected, with a control to it that told him she'd been managing her own responses for a long time. "Elias Cade," he said. "I trap and trade out of the Guadalupe Mountains. I come through town twice a year." "I know who Elias Cade is," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that made him think she might have observed him from a distance before, in the same way he had perhaps observed her without knowing he was doing it. "What I am asking is what you want in return." "Nothing today," he said. "I I want to ask you something, but it can wait." "What kind of something?" she said, and her eyes did not move from his face. "The kind that you should have time to think about," he said. "Come and have supper with me tonight at the hotel dining room, and I'll ask you then." Clara Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the receipt on the bar. She looked back at him. "You cleared $300 of debt before you even knew my answer to whatever you were planning to ask me," she said. "I did," he confirmed. "That's either the most generous thing anybody has ever done for me," she said, "or the most frightening." "I expect you'll figure out which one over supper," he said. And she said, 6 o'clock, and went back to her glasses. She did not work for Gerald Potts after that moment. She put down the cloth, folded it neatly on the edge of the bar, took off the apron she'd been wearing, and walked out of the Red Bluff Saloon at noon on a Tuesday in October, with the receipt folded against her chest and 2 years' worth of invisible weight lifted off her shoulders. The afternoon air hit her face when she stepped onto the boardwalk, and she stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, breathing it in, and she allowed herself 10 seconds of something that felt dangerously close to joy before she put it away and went to deal with the practical question of where she was going to sleep tonight, since she'd been renting the upstairs room from Gerald for the past 2 years. She had a friend in town, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran the dry goods store with her husband Ben. And Ruth had been telling Clara for the better part of 18 months that she was welcome to the spare room above the store anytime she wanted to stop letting Gerald Potts arrange her life for her. Clara went there now, receipt still folded against her chest, and Ruth opened the door and looked at her face and said, "What happened?" And Clara told her the whole story in Ruth's kitchen over a cup of coffee, and Ruth sat very still through the telling of it with her hands wrapped around her own cup, and then said very quietly, "Elias Cade." "You know him?" Clara asked. "Everybody who's been in Sweetwater Creek longer than 5 years knows of him," Ruth said. "He doesn't talk much and he doesn't come to town often, but when he does, people notice. Ben says he's the most capable man he's ever seen come through this country." She paused. "He's never done anything like this before, though. Not that I've heard of." "He wants to ask me something," Clara said. "Over supper." Ruth looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who had known her friend long enough to be allowed a certain amount of pointed observation. "Do you have a dress?" she asked. "Ruth," Clara said. "Yeah, I'm just asking," Ruth said, and stood up to look in the back room. Clara had a dress. It was not glamorous. It was a deep blue cotton, simple in cut, but it was clean, and it fit her well, and when she wore it with her hair down instead of pinned back, she looked like a woman who had been allowed to rest for the first time in a very long while. She stood in front of the small mirror in Ruth's spare room at 5:45 and looked at her own reflection with an expression that was half assessment and half something she didn't quite know what to call. Thomas had been dead for 2 years. She had loved him, not in the sweeping, consuming way she had once imagined love might feel when she was young, but in the steady, reliable way of people who have chosen each other carefully and worked hard together and built something real. He had been a good man, and his death had been sudden and senseless, and had left her with nothing. The debt had swallowed the homestead, and the homestead had been all they had, and the grief had been genuine and deep. But grief had not stopped Gerald Potts from presenting his ledger the day after the funeral, and life had not paused while she sorted out her heart, and 2 years in a saloon washing glasses and enduring Gerald's quarterly adjustments to what she owed had stripped away a certain kind of softness that she had not been entirely sure she wanted back. She was not naive. She was 28 years old and had lived enough of a life to know that men did not clear $300 of debt out of pure altruism. And she was walking into this supper with her eyes open and her spine straight and her expectations firmly in the category of realistic. But there was something about the way he had looked at her, not through her, not over her, not at her in the appraising way that men in saloons tend to look at women, but directly at her, like she was the only thing in the room that mattered, that had put a small and persistent warmth somewhere in the region of her sternum that she had been trying to argue herself out of all afternoon. Elias Cade was already seated when she arrived at the hotel dining room. He had cleaned up. His hair was still long and dark, still falling past his collar, but he had combed it back and his shirt was clean, dark gray linen with the sleeves rolled to the forearm, and she could see the breadth of him across the shoulders and the strong line of his jaw freshly shaved, and she was aware that approximately half of the other diners in the room were watching them from the corners of their eyes. He stood when she came through the door. That, too, was not nothing. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Elias," she said, because she had decided on the walk over that if she was going to sit across from this man and hear whatever he intended to say, she was not going to do it with the formality of a stranger. He pulled out her chair. She sat. He sat across from her and looked at her with those steady gray eyes and said nothing for a moment in a way that was not awkward, but was instead very deliberate, like he was making sure he had her full attention before he said what he came to say. The hotel dining room served a reasonable supper by Sweetwater Creek standards, beef and roasted corn and fresh bread and a decent pot of coffee, and they ate most of it before he asked her anything, because he seemed to understand without being told that she had not eaten a proper meal in the middle of a day in longer than she cared to remember, and he let her eat. She found, to her own surprise, that she was not uncomfortable. The silence between them was not empty. It had a texture to it, something warm and careful, like two people who were paying attention to each other without needing to fill every moment with noise. "You said you wanted to ask me something," she said eventually, when the bread was gone and the coffee had been poured. "I did," he said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, large hands scarred across the knuckles, the hands of a man who worked outdoors in all seasons, and he looked at her directly. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. The room continued on around them. Cutlery clicked. Somebody laughed softly at another table. A breeze came through the window. Clara Whitmore sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "You bought my debt this morning, and now you are asking me to marry you in the same afternoon." "Yes," he said. "We have never had a conversation before today," she said. "That's true," he said. "Then why?" she asked. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, delivered with the directness of someone who needed an honest answer. He was quiet for a moment in the way that told her he was choosing his words with care, not because he was manufacturing something, but because the real answer mattered to him and he wanted to get it right. "I've come through this town twice a year for 6 years," he said. "I saw you the first time 2 years ago, just after your husband passed. I saw what Gerald Potts was doing to you, the way that ledger kept you tied to that place. I saw you working in there every time I came through, and I saw you keeping yourself together in a situation that would have broken most people." He paused. "I am not a man who says things I don't mean, so I will tell you plainly. I have thought about you in the mountains for 2 years. That's a long time to think about somebody you have never properly spoken to, and I decided this fall that I was done with just thinking." Clara looked at her coffee cup. She looked at his hands on the table. She looked at his face. "That's either the most honest thing a man has ever said to me," she said, "or the most presumptuous." "Probably both," he said, and one corner of his mouth moved in something that was close to a smile, and she found that she wanted to see the rest of it. "I don't know you," she said. "Not really." "No," he agreed, "but I'm asking you to let that change. Come up to the mountains with me, not as my property, not as part of some arrangement, as my wife, with everything that means. I have a cabin, I have land, I have means enough to live well. I'm not a perfect man, and I don't pretend otherwise. But I will not add to your ledger. I will not keep score of what you cost me. I will not make you smaller." There was a long silence. "That last part," Clara said softly. "You said that deliberately." "Yes," he said, "because I think you've been made to feel like a cost for a long time, and I think you're about done with it." She sat with that for a moment. Outside, the evening was settling over Sweetwater Creek, the last orange light of the October sun laying itself across the dusty street. "I will not give you an answer tonight," she said at last. "You've been thinking about this for 2 years. Give me 2 weeks." "2 weeks," he said, without hesitation, without disappointment. "I'll stay in town." "You don't have to do that," she said. "I want to," he said. "I'd like to spend those 2 weeks letting you know me properly. If at the end of them you say no, I'll go back up to the mountains, and I'll never trouble you with this again. The debt is cleared regardless. That was never a condition." She nodded slowly. 2 weeks, she said. He walked her back to Ruth's store afterward, and at the door he stopped and looked at her for a moment in the evening light, and he said, "Thank you for supper." She said, "You paid for it." And he said, "You gave me your time." And she went inside with the warmth in her sternum substantially harder to argue with than it had been that afternoon. Ruth was waiting in the kitchen with her hands wrapped around an empty cup and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for a very long time and is extremely determined not to appear as though she has been doing so. "Well," Ruth said. "He asked me to marry him," Clara said. Ruth's cup hit the table. "He what?" "I told him 2 weeks," Clara said, and she sat down heavily in the kitchen chair and let out a breath that seemed to have been stored up for the better part of 2 years. The 2 weeks that followed were unlike anything Clara Whitmore had experienced since before her husband died, and perhaps unlike anything she had experienced before that, either. Elias Cade did not court her the way men in dime novels courted women. There were no dramatic declarations in the middle of the street and no flowers left on doorsteps, because Elias was not that kind of man, and Clara would not have known what to do with it if he had been. Instead, he came to find her every morning after breakfast and asked her what she was doing, and then he helped her do it. He was useful in the way that very capable men tend to be useful, thoroughly and without making a show of it. The first morning, he found her at the dry goods store, trying to help Ben Calloway repair a section of the back porch that had been rotting since spring, and he looked at the damage for about 30 seconds, and then picked up the hammer and did in 2 hours what would have taken Ben the better part of a week. Not because he rushed or showed off, because his hands knew wood the way a musician's hands know their instrument, and every strike of the hammer was exactly where it needed to be. He took her riding on the 3rd day. She had a horse, a broad-backed roan mare she had been boarding at the livery for a monthly fee she could barely manage, and he rode a big black mountain horse that moved with the confidence of an animal that had crossed serious country. They rode east of town through the cedar breaks and the rocky flats, and he talked to her about the Guadalupe Mountains, about what his life looked like up there. Not to convince her, she understood the distinction, but because she had asked, and he answered honestly. "How did you end up there?" she asked as they picked their way along a dry creek bed, the pecans and cottonwoods going yellow above them. "I came out from Tennessee with my father when I was 14, he said. "He was a trapper before he was anything else. We came out to the Guadalupes, and he taught me everything he knew, and then he died when I was 22, and I stayed because the mountains made sense to me in a way that town never did." He paused. "I built the cabin the year he died. Spent every hour I wasn't trapping putting up those walls. It helped." "Grief work," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." "I understand that," she said, and he nodded, and they rode for a while in a silence that meant they both understood something about the other that did not need to be spoken aloud. On the 5th day, Gerald Potts came to find Clara at the general store, where she had begun working part-time, because Ruth had offered it, and Clara had accepted with a gratitude she had not let herself show too much of. Gerald came in around mid-morning with his watch chain and his small eyes, and stood at the counter and told her with a smile that oiled itself across his face that she ought to reconsider her situation, that the receipt she had been given was perhaps not entirely legal in its nature, and that she might find herself back in a difficult position if she wasn't careful. Clara was behind the counter with a ledger of her own, Ben's inventory book, and she put down her pen and looked at Gerald Potts and said very calmly, "Get out of this store, Gerald." "Now, Clara," he began. He did not finish the sentence because Elias Cade came through the door of the general store at that precise moment, having been on his way to find Clara and bring her the coffee he was carrying in each hand, and he stopped when he saw Gerald, and he took in the situation in approximately 3 seconds with those gray eyes, and he set the coffee cups down on the nearest surface and stepped between Clara and Gerald Potts without a word. He did not threaten Gerald. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood in the space between them and looked at Gerald Potts with an expression that conveyed, with absolute precision, that Gerald should leave this establishment immediately and should not return with the intention of causing Clara Whitmore any further difficulty, now or at any point in the future. Gerald Potts left the establishment. Elias picked up both coffee cups and brought one to Clara, who took it with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, considering, and he sat on the stool on the customer side of the counter and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said, then after a pause, "Thank you." "He'll think twice before he tries that again," Elias said. He might try it when you're not here, she said. I know, he said, and there was something in his voice that told her he was aware of the limitations of physical presence as a deterrent, and that it was part of why he was asking her to come with him to the mountains and not just offering to stand between her and Gerald Potts twice a day. On the 7th evening, they sat together on the front steps of Ruth's store after supper, because Ruth had made enough food for half the town and insisted Elias stay. And afterward, Clara and Elias found themselves outside in the cool October dark with a lantern between them and the stars working themselves out overhead. Tell me about the cabin, she said. So he told her. He told her about the way it sat on the east slope of the mountain, with a view of the basin below that in the mornings was full of mist and in the evenings was full of color. He told her about the spring that fed cold, clear water to the property year-round, and the garden he had tried 3 times to grow and finally gotten right on the 3rd attempt. He told her about the winter snows that could lock you in for weeks at a time, and how he had learned over the years to take it as something other than imprisonment, as a kind of enforced stillness that had its own value once you stopped fighting it. Are you a man who needs people around him? She asked. No, he said honestly, but I'm a man who has started to notice the absence of one particular person. She looked at the lantern for a moment. Thomas and I used to sit like this in the evenings, she said, on the porch of the homestead. It was nothing fancy, but it was ours, and we had worked for it, and I was proud of it. She stopped. When Gerald took it, I think that was harder than the debt, the place. I know, Elias said, and then, carefully, the cabin is yours too if you come. I want to say that clearly. Not borrowed, not lent. Yours. She turned to look at him in the lantern light. His face was serious, with that particular steadiness that she had come to understand was not coldness, but was instead a kind of deep consistency. He was the same at noon as he was at midnight, the same in a crisis as he was in a quiet moment, and after 2 years of living in a world built on instability and shifting ledgers, that quality in him struck her somewhere deep and essential. You mean that, she said. It was not a question. I do not say things I don't mean, he said. She nodded slowly. They sat in the October dark a while longer. On the 9th day, a problem arrived in Sweetwater Creek in the form of a man named Doyle Ferris. Doyle Ferris was the kind of man the West produced in some quantity during those years, not outright violent by nature, but deeply opportunistic, with a comfortable relationship with legal gray areas and a tendency to make himself the center of whatever situation he found himself in. He had ridden with a cattle outfit north of San Antonio and had come south looking for work or for trouble or for both, and he had been in the Red Bluff Saloon for 2 days when he heard the story of Elias Cade buying out Clara Whitmore's debt and asking her to marry him, because in a town the size of Sweetwater Creek, that kind of story had approximately 6 hours before it belonged to everybody. Doyle Ferris had encountered Clara Whitmore in the saloon 2 months previous on a supply run of his own and had taken a liking to her in the way that men like Doyle Ferris took a liking to things, with the unexamined assumption that his interest was sufficient justification for his pursuit. Clara had rebuffed him with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been working in a saloon for 2 years, and he had gone away with his pride only moderately dented. He came to find her at the general store on the 9th day of Elias's 2 weeks, and he was not interested in Gerald Potts's approach of legal ambiguity. He came in loudly, with his hat pushed back in the manner of a man who considers himself interesting. I hear you've been set free from the Red Bluff, he said to Clara, who was measuring out flour behind the counter. Bought and paid for by some mountain man. Cleared of debt, Clara said without looking up, is not the same as bought and paid for. That's so, Doyle said. Way I hear it, he asked you to marry him same day. Doesn't sound like a man who cleared your debt out of charity. Clara set down the flour scoop and looked at him steadily. What is it you want, Mr. Ferris? I want you to consider your options, he said, and he leaned against the counter with the easy confidence of a man who genuinely believed this was charming. Before you go off up some mountain with a man you've known less than 2 weeks. My options are my own business, Clara said. I've got a standing at the Rocking H outfit, Doyle said. Good wages coming in. I could... Mr. Ferris, Clara said, I'm going to ask you to leave now. I just think... Clara! Elias's voice came from the doorway. He had a habit, she was beginning to notice, of arriving at precisely the moment things required arriving. He stood in the doorway with a sack of grain over one shoulder, He'd been helping load deliveries at the back of the store, and he looked at Doyle Ferris with an expression of complete tranquility that somehow managed to be significantly more unnerving than anger would have been. Doyle Ferris straightened up and turned and looked at Elias, and he had the good sense to reassess rapidly. Elias was half a head taller than Doyle and substantially broader, and the ease with which he was holding that grain sack made the weight of it seem entirely irrelevant. He set it down slowly and looked at Doyle and said, "The lady asked you to leave." "I was just having a conversation," Doyle said, but the confidence had drained out of his voice somewhat. "Not anymore," Elias said. It was said quietly, pleasantly almost, and it was entirely immovable. Doyle Ferris left, and he did not come back, and when Clara heard later that week that he had ridden north to join another outfit, she felt the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who has watched something unpleasant remove itself from her vicinity. She was beginning to understand, with a clarity that surprised her, that life with Elias Cade would not be a life spent worrying about who was going to find her next or what they were going to demand. She was also beginning to understand that she liked him, not just trusted him or appreciated him or felt safe around him, genuinely liked him in the way you like a person whose company rearranges your day into something better than it was before they arrived. On the 11th day, she went to visit the homestead east of town. She had not been back since the day she walked away from it. It was a 2-mile ride, and she went alone in the early morning with the October mist still sitting low over the grass, and she stood at the fence line and looked at the small house that had been hers and Thomas's, and was now occupied by a family named Garrett who had bought it from Gerald Potts the winter after Clara gave it up. There was smoke from the chimney, and a line of washing out back and children's voices somewhere inside, and it looked lived in and cared for in a way that should have been painful, but was somehow, she found, mostly just peaceful. She stood there for 10 minutes. She cried a little, quietly, for Thomas and for the homestead, and for the years that had been hard, and for the girl she had been when she had come to this piece of Texas land with hope and good work ethic and love for a man who died too soon. Then she turned her horse around and rode back to town and went to find Elias. He was at the livery, working with a farrier on his mountain horse's shoes, crouched down beside the animal's foreleg with his long hair falling forward and the muscles of his back and arms working under his shirt, and he looked up when she rode in and stood without hurrying. She dismounted and walked up to him and looked at him in the morning light. "I've been thinking," she said. "I know," he said. "I spent 11 days deciding whether I could trust you," she said. "And I think I've been asking the wrong question." He waited. "The question isn't whether I can trust you," she said. "I think I've known the answer to that since the first evening. The question is whether I'm brave enough to choose something again after the last time." She paused. "And I think the answer to that is yes." His face was very still, and in that stillness she saw something that moved in him like the surface of deep water. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It's a yes," she said. He took one step toward her and brought his hand up and cupped her jaw in his large, scarred hand with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the size and strength of him, and he looked at her face for a long moment as if he was memorizing it. And then he kissed her. A careful, quiet, thorough kiss that tasted of coffee and morning air and something else she didn't have a word for yet. Behind them, the farrier made himself very busy with his tools and pretended to be fascinated by a horseshoe. They were married 4 days later, on a Saturday in mid-October in the small Baptist church at the end of Sweetwater Creek's main street. The minister was a lean, practical man named Reverend Hale, who had married and buried half the people in the county and did both with equal seriousness. Ruth Calloway stood beside Clara in the church in a dress that she had pressed the night before, and Ben stood beside Elias, and the church had perhaps 20 people in the pews, because news in a small town is a reliable form of advertisement. Clara wore the blue dress and she had her hair down, and when she came through the church door and walked up the aisle and saw Elias standing at the front of the church in his good shirt with his dark hair and his gray eyes, she watched those eyes find her and not leave her for the entire length of the aisle. She felt something open in her chest, like a window being unlatched after a long winter. The ceremony was short and unadorned. When Reverend Hale asked Elias if he took Clara Whitmore to be his wife, Elias said, "I do," in a voice that was steady and certain and did not require any volume to be heard clearly by every single person in the building. When he asked Clara, she said it back to him with her chin up and her eyes on his face and no hesitation. He slid a ring onto her finger, a simple band of gold he had ridden 3 hours to the nearest larger town to purchase 2 days before. And she looked at it on her hand for a moment and then back at him, and the smile that came across her face then was not the careful, contained expression he had seen her wear for the past 2 weeks. It was something full and genuine, a little surprised by itself, and it changed her face entirely, and he committed every detail of it to memory like a man preparing for a long journey. They had supper at the hotel that evening, Ruth and Ben and a few others who had become, in the space of 2 weeks, the kind of people who felt like witnesses to something. There was cake, because Ruth had made one without telling anyone she was going to, and there was good whiskey brought out for the occasion. And when Clara laughed at something Ben said across the table, Elias sat back and watched her laugh and felt the particular peace of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was heading, but recognizes, with complete certainty, as where he belongs. They left for the mountains the next morning. Clara had 2 saddlebags in a trunk that fit on the pack mule Elias had brought down for exactly this purpose. She stood outside Ruth's store in the early morning with her mare already loaded, and Ruth holding both her hands. And Ruth was not crying exactly, but her eyes were significantly brighter than usual. "You write to me," Ruth said. "I will write," Clara said, "every chance I get." "And if it doesn't," Ruth began, and Clara shook her head. "It will," she said, with a certainty she had not expected to find in herself, and she meant it. She hugged Ruth and Ben, who was gruff and kind about it, and then she went to where Elias was already mounted on his black horse, looking out at the morning like a man who had all the patience in the world, and she climbed up onto her mare and fell in beside him. They rode out of Sweetwater Creek on a clear October morning, the cedar brakes going golden around them and the far blue line of the Guadalupe Mountains on the horizon. And Clara looked back once at the town, at the crooked main street and the Red Bluff Saloon and the small Baptist church and Ruth's dry goods store, and she breathed it in and breathed it out and turned back to face the mountains and rode on. The journey to the mountains took 3 days, and every one of them was different from the last. The first day they crossed the flat cedar country east of the mountains, riding through country that smelled of dry grass and stone, pausing at noon by a water hole where cattle tracks pressed the soft mud and hawks floated high above on thermals. Elias knew the country with the intimacy of long acquaintance, and he pointed out things as they passed: a red-tailed hawk's nest in a dead juniper, the far-off shape of a pronghorn herd moving across a distant hillside, the place where a creek ran underground for half a mile and came back up cold and clear among the roots of a cottonwood grove. He was not a talker in the way of men who talk to fill silence, but he was a talker when something was worth saying, and she found that the rhythm of their conversation over those 3 days settled into something natural and easy, like a gait they had both fallen into without planning it. The second day they began to climb, and the country changed. The flats gave way to limestone ridges, and then to steeper country where the mountains began to assert themselves properly, the vegetation shifting from cedar and cactus to pinyon pine and oak, the air cooling noticeably as they gained elevation. Clara had not been in mountain country before, and she found it doing something to her breathing, not the altitude, which was not extreme, but the scale of it, the way the ridges rose above her and the sky felt closer, and the world seemed simultaneously larger and more contained. "It's beautiful," she said on the afternoon of the second day, from an overlook above a long descending valley. "It is," he said. He did not add anything because he didn't need to. They camped the second night in a draw protected from the wind, under a sky so thick with stars that it seemed nearly solid, and Elias built a fire that pushed back the October mountain cold efficiently and made coffee and heated beans and hardtack, and Clara sat across the fire from him and thought with a kind of quiet wonder that she had made this decision 4 days into knowing him properly, and she had not once, not in any corner of her practical and experienced mind, felt that it was wrong. They talked in the firelight about small things and large things. He told her about his father, a big, quiet Tennessean named Samuel Cade, who had loved the mountains with a religious conviction and died of a fever at 61, and whom Elias spoke about with the particular mixture of reverence and grief that belongs to people who have lost someone who taught them almost everything they know. She told him about her parents, both gone now, her mother of pneumonia when Clara was 19, her father of old age 5 years later. She told him about meeting Thomas Whitmore at a church social in Fredericksburg, and how he had been the steadiest, most reliable man she had ever met, and how she had loved that about him and built a life around it. She said it plainly, without apology, because she had decided that if Elias was going to know her, he was going to know the whole of her, and a woman's past love was not something to be embarrassed of. He listened without interrupting, without the discomfort that some men would have shown, and when she finished, he said, "He sounds like he was a good man," and she said, "He was," and they left it there, which was exactly where it belonged. The third day they rode into the high country where Elias's land sat, and in the late afternoon, coming through a stand of tall pines, the cabin came into view. She stopped her horse. It was not what she had been imagining, which had been something roughly built and functional, a trapper's shelter, essentially. What she was looking at was a home. It was built of stone and timber, fitted together with a care and skill that you could see even from a distance, and it sat on a flat shelf of land with the mountain rising behind it, and below it, a view that opened out over the basin to the west, the last sunlight of the day laying itself across the rock in bands of orange and deep gold. There was a porch across the front with 2 chairs on it. The chairs were something that made her throat tighten unexpectedly, because 2 chairs meant that somewhere in himself, even alone up here, he had kept space for the possibility of company. There was a garden plot at the side of the cabin, put to bed for winter but neatly edged, and a stone-walled spring box a few yards behind the building, and a small stable for the horses, and wood piles stacked as high as the eaves with the efficiency of a man who understood winter. "Elias," she said. He had stopped beside her, and he was watching her face instead of the cabin. "This is real," she said. "Everything I told you about it was true," he said. "I know," she said. "I meant, it's real. It's a real home." She paused. "The chair's on the porch." He was quiet for a moment. "I put the second one there 4 years ago," he said. "I'm not entirely sure what I thought I was doing." She looked at him, and he looked back at her, and they rode down to the cabin together in the long gold light of a mountain afternoon. The first weeks in the cabin were a kind of revelation for Clara, and not an entirely uncomplicated one. She was not a woman who struggled with hard work. She had never been that woman. But the rhythms of mountain life were different from anything she had known, and she spent the first 2 weeks simply learning them, watching how the day organized itself up here, where the water came from, and how the heat was managed and how the stores were arranged for winter. Elias was a patient teacher. He did not assume she knew things, and he did not explain things she already understood. He watched her closely enough to know the difference, which she appreciated enormously. He showed her how the spring box worked, how the root cellar was organized, where the best firewood came from, and how to split it properly so it seasoned right. He showed her the kitchen garden plan for the coming spring, what grew best at this altitude and in this soil, what the deer would eat if you didn't fence it properly. She cooked, and he ate with the genuine appreciation of a man who had been cooking for himself for many years and was conscious of the quality difference. She was a good cook, had been a good cook her whole life, and the first time she made a proper beef stew with the onions from the root cellar and the dried herbs hanging in the kitchen, he ate 2 bowls and was quiet for a long moment afterward and said, "I have not eaten that well in a long time." And she felt a satisfaction in that which was both domestic and deeply personal. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. He read. He had a collection of books that surprised her in its breadth, history and natural philosophy, and a well-worn Bible, and several novels that he admitted to having read more than once, which endeared him to her considerably. She sewed and she wrote in the journal she had always kept, even through the worst of the Gerald Potts years. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were simply quiet together, and the quality of that shared quiet was, she discovered, one of the things she had been most hungry for without knowing it, the presence of another person that did not require performance or management. The marriage, in all its private dimensions, was not a thing she had been sure of going into it. She had known Thomas and had not been certain of it either, and had found with Thomas that love in practice was less a feeling than a decision made fresh every morning. With Elias, it was something different, something that had more weight to it, more heat, more of the complex texture of a man who was entirely himself and invited her to be entirely herself in return. He was gentle in private in a way that the breadth of his shoulders and the size of his hands suggested he did not have to be, and the gentleness was not performance, but actual care, and she found herself arriving at that feeling she had been warned not to expect too soon, the feeling of being known. November came in with cold and a week of rain that hammered the mountain and kept them inside for days at a stretch, and she discovered that she did not mind it. The cabin was warm and dry and well built for exactly this purpose, and the enforced closeness of it was not constraint but something else entirely, a kind of permission to stop moving and simply be where she was. She wrote to Ruth at the end of November and filled 4 pages because there was too much to say, and she had decided to say all of it. Ruth wrote back by the end of December, a letter that arrived via the pass rider who came through the mountain country twice a month, and it was full of Ben's doings and the news of Sweetwater Creek and a postscript that said that Gerald Potts had been found to have been doing much the same thing to a family named Hollis as he had done to Clara, and that the county judge had finally gotten involved, and that the general sentiment in Sweetwater Creek regarding Gerald Potts's current situation was one of considerable satisfaction. Clara read that part out loud to Elias, who was splitting kindling in the dooryard, and he stopped and looked at the axe in his hand, and then back at her and said, "Good," with a finality that was its own kind of justice. Winter settled into the mountains in earnest by January, and the world outside the cabin turned white and still and enormous, and Clara found that Elias had been right. There was something in the enforced stillness that once you stopped fighting it, was genuinely valuable. She read books she had not had time for in years. She learned to make the particular kind of camp bread that Elias's father had taught him. She learned to identify the animals by their tracks in the snow, kneeling in the powder outside the cabin door with Elias crouched beside her, his breath making clouds in the frozen air, his finger tracing the delicate signature of a fox that had passed in the night. She also, in those long winter months, discovered things about grief that she had not had the stillness before to discover. There were evenings when Thomas came into her mind with a force she had not expected, not with the corrosive grief of the immediate loss, but with a kind of warm ache, the feeling of missing someone who was worth missing. She did not hide these moments from Elias, because hiding things from him felt both impossible and wrong. And one evening in January, she simply told him that she was thinking about Thomas, and he put down his book and gave her his full attention and said, "Tell me about him." And she talked for an hour, and he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, and at the end she felt lighter by the weight of something she had not realized she had still been carrying. "Does it trouble you?" she asked. "That I loved him?" "No," Elias said without any hesitation. "You're here because of who you are, and who you are includes loving him. That's not something I want taken out of you." He paused. "I think love that was real doesn't stop being real when the person is gone. I think it changes shape." She looked at him across the firelight. "That is the wisest thing I've heard anyone say about grief," she said. "My father told me that when my mother died," he said, "when I was 6. She had not known about his mother. She asked, and he told her, quietly and without self-pity, about a small woman named Elias Cade who had died of childbirth complications. The child, too. A daughter who never drew a first breath when Elias was 6 years old. He had been raised after that by his father alone, in camps and mountain lodges, and eventually in the Guadalupes, and the absence of his mother was something he had grown around rather than over, the way a tree grows around an old wound in its trunk. She reached across and put her hand on his, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat in the firelight with the mountain cold pressing on the windows and the fire answering it, and she thought that this was what she had not known she was looking for. Not rescue, not security in the simple financial sense, but this, a person to sit with in the honest dark. By February, she knew she was expecting a child. She told him on a morning when the snow was blue-white outside and the fire had just been lit, and the cabin was cold but warming, and he was still at the table with his coffee, and she came and stood in front of him and told him directly, the way she did everything, and watched his face. What crossed his face in that moment was something that she held in her memory for the rest of her life. It was not surprise exactly, though there was surprise in it. It was something deeper and less composed, a kind of awed, helpless joy that he had no mechanism to contain, and it moved through his features like light through water, and he set down his coffee cup and stood and took her face in his hands very carefully, and he said, "Clara," and nothing else for a moment, and then he gathered her against him with the controlled strength of a man who knew exactly how strong he was, and she put her face against his chest and felt his heart beating hard and fast, and she closed her eyes. "Are you frightened?" he asked into her hair. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, which was exactly the right answer. Spring came to the mountains in late March, arriving first as a smell in the air, and then as a thinning of the snowpack on the south-facing slopes, and then as a great general thaw that sent water running down every canyon and draw and turned the ground around the spring box to a rich, enthusiastic mud. The pronghorn came back down from the high country. Elk moved through the timber below the cabin. Clara planted the kitchen garden in April with a precision that Elias watched with something close to admiration. She had a gardener's instinct and an organizer's mind, and the garden plan she laid out in the dirt was substantially better thought through than anything he had managed in his 3 previous attempts at the project. He took her to collect the winter's furs in April. The traps had been pulled in February and the furs cured through the cold months, and she helped him sort and pack them for the spring trading run, learning the differences between pelts, with the quick attention of someone who was genuinely interested and not merely politely engaged. She asked good questions. She challenged his valuations on 2 pieces based on quality arguments he had not considered, and was right about both. "You would have been good at commerce," he told her. "I was good at commerce," she said. "I ran Thomas's accounts for 5 years. Gerald Potts just made sure I didn't have a chance to apply it to my own situation." There was a sharpness in that which she did not try to smooth away, and he did not ask her to. In May, when the mountain passes were clear enough for comfortable travel, they rode down to Sweetwater Creek together for the spring trading run. It was the first time Clara had been back to town since the wedding, and riding down the familiar main street on her mare with Elias beside her and the pregnancy only beginning to show in the line of her dress, she felt the compound strangeness of returning to a place you have lived in as a different person than the one who left it. Ruth saw her from the doorway of the dry goods store and came down the steps in a rush and embraced her on the street with the thoroughness of a woman who has been waiting months for exactly this moment, and Clara laughed and held on. And over Ruth's shoulder she saw Ben grinning and Reverend Hale lifting his hat from the other side of the street, and it came home to her that this town, with all its difficulties, had people in it who were genuinely glad she existed, and that was not nothing. She told Ruth about the baby in the store while Elias was at the trading post with his furs, and Ruth sat down heavily on the stool behind the counter and put her hand over her mouth for a moment, and then she said, "Oh, Clara," with a warmth that Clara would carry back up the mountain with her like a coal in her pocket. Gerald Potts was nowhere to be seen in Sweetwater Creek, and when Clara asked Ruth about it, Ruth told her that he had left town in February ahead of a formal complaint being filed with the county court, and that the Red Bluff Saloon had been taken over by a man named John Parrish, who ran it considerably more honestly and had kept Hector on as the permanent barman. Clara heard all of this standing in the general store in the May sunshine and felt the last coil of anxiety she had been carrying about Gerald loosen and drop away entirely. They stayed in Sweetwater Creek for 4 days, long enough to resupply, to see Ruth and Ben properly, to have supper with Reverend Hale, who asked after them with the genuine interest of a man who had put them together in his church 7 months ago, and took a pastoral interest in the outcome. Elias sold his furs and negotiated for seeds and tools and several specific books that Clara had mentioned wanting, and he did not tell her about the books until they were packed on the mule for the ride back up, and when she found them and understood that he had gone specifically looking for them, she stood in the livery yard and looked at him with an expression that required a moment to resolve itself. "Elias Cade," she said. "It was nothing," he said. "It's we." "It was not nothing," she said. and she went to him and kissed him in the livery yard in front of his horse, and the mule, and the indifferent livery boy. And he kissed her back with his hands in her hair, and made no effort whatsoever to be subtle about it, and the livery boy found a very interesting thing to look at on the other side of the yard. They rode back up to the mountains in the green high May, the countryside exploding with wildflowers and new grass, and the cabin waited for them on its shelf of land with the smoke hole ready and the garden showing its first green shoots, and they came home. The baby arrived in September. He came in the early morning after a labor that Elias endured in the main room of the cabin with the focused, helpless intensity of a man accustomed to fixing things who cannot fix this particular thing, and must instead trust the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Hart, who had ridden up from the nearest valley settlement at Elias's request 2 weeks before the due date just to be present, having delivered approximately 40 children in her 40 years of practice. She told Elias to go chop wood, and he chopped enough wood to last through 2 winters, and he wore a path in the ground in front of the cabin, and he was inside in 3 strides when Mrs. Hart opened the door and said, "Mr. Cade, you have a son." He walked into the bedroom, and Clara was propped against the headboard with her hair dark and damp against her neck and her face carrying the particular exhaustion of a woman who has just done the hardest thing a person can do. And in her arms was a small, red, furious person who was already deciding that his opinion of the world was going to be a strong one. Elias sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the child, and then at Clara. And his face did that thing again, that awed, helpless openness. And Clara put the baby into his arms and watched him hold his son for the first time, with those large, scarred hands more careful than they had ever been. And she thought that she would have walked through everything she had walked through twice over if this moment was at the end of it. "What do we name him?" Elias asked, his voice lower than usual. "Samuel," Clara said, "for your father." He looked up at her over the top of the baby's head, and in his gray eyes she saw the thing she had been watching grow in him for the past year, not just love, which had been there almost from the beginning, but the settled, comprehensive tenderness of a man who has found the life he was made for and knows it. "Samuel," he said. Samuel Cade was a loud, opinionated, thoroughly healthy child who slept barely enough and had views about nearly everything, and who, by the time he was pulling himself upright against the cabin furniture at 9 months old, had already established himself as the organizing principle around which the household revolved. He had Elias's dark hair and Clara's eyes, the green hazel of them, which caught the mountain light in the mornings in a way that made both his parents stop what they were doing on a regular basis just to look at him. Elias was, as a father, exactly what Clara had suspected he would be, present and steady and quietly devoted. He was not a man who performed his feelings, but he was incapable of indifference to his son, and the sight of him carrying Samuel on one broad shoulder through the cabin while Samuel grabbed fistfuls of dark hair and tugged with absolute confidence in the strength of the person carrying him was something that lived permanently in Clara's chest as a particular kind of warmth. The years moved through the mountains the way years do in places where the seasons are large, with a fullness and a rhythm that made the time feel both fast and deeply inhabited. Clara expanded the garden substantially in the spring of 1875, adding a second plot on the south-facing slope below the cabin that got more sun, and it was abundantly productive in a way that allowed them not just to sustain themselves through the winter, but to trade surplus with the settlements in the valley below. She had been keeping careful records of yields and varieties and conditions, and by the 3rd year, her garden management was something the valley settlers came to her to ask about, which she found deeply, quietly satisfying. Elias continued his trapping through the seasons, but as Samuel grew and the homestead became more productive, the character of the mountain work shifted. He spent more time on the land itself, building a proper stable to replace the smaller structure, extending the stone wall of the spring box, clearing a lower meadow for hay that would feed the horses through the winter months without requiring purchase. He did all of this with the same methodical competence he brought to everything, and Clara worked beside him on most of it. And they had between them the particular efficiency of 2 people who have learned each other's rhythms and can work in proximity without friction. They argued, of course. Real marriages do, and theirs was a real marriage between 2 people who had opinions and expressed them. Their arguments were not cold or cruel. They were the arguments of two people with different experiences and equally strong characters, and they resolved them the way they resolved most things, directly, without theater, and usually over coffee at the kitchen table when Samuel was asleep. Clara was not a woman who let things sit unaddressed, and Elias was not a man who withdrew rather than discussed, and those two qualities together meant that nothing stayed unresolved for long. In the autumn of 1875, they rode down to Sweetwater Creek for the fall trading run, and Clara was expecting again, far enough along that it showed clearly, and Ruth gasped when she saw her come through the door and immediately sat her down in the kitchen chair and began asking questions. Ruth and Ben had a child of their own by then, a daughter of 2 years named Josephine, who regarded Samuel with the imperious suspicion of a child who has been the primary small person in a household and is not entirely certain about the addition of a new one. Samuel regarded Josephine with complete fascination and attempted to give her a piece of dried apple, which she accepted with a somewhat reduced suspicion, and by the end of the afternoon they were on reasonable terms. The second child was born in February of 1876, in another early morning, and this time Mrs. Hart arrived 2 days before and stayed 3 days after and declared both Clara and the new arrival to be in excellent health. The new arrival was a daughter, small and fierce-eyed and with a shock of auburn hair that was entirely her mother's, and when Clara saw that hair, she laughed out loud, which was not the usual first response of a woman who had just delivered a child but was entirely in keeping with who Clara was. Elias held his daughter in the same careful hands and looked at her with the same awed openness he had shown for Samuel, and she grabbed his finger with her tiny fist with an enthusiasm that delighted him entirely. They named her Ellen, for his mother, which Clara had suggested without being asked, because she had been thinking about it since Samuel was born, and this seemed right, and the way Elias looked at her when she said it confirmed that it was. Ellen Cade turned out to be a more tranquil child than her brother, not passive, not quiet exactly, but less inclined to voice her every opinion at volume, more given to watching things with those sharp eyes and taking her time about conclusions. She had her grandmother's name, and she seemed, as she grew, to have inherited some quality of presence that belonged to a person known only through story and love. Samuel, at 3 years old, took his role as older brother with a seriousness that was both touching and occasionally exhausting. He brought Ellen things, pebbles, interesting sticks, a feather he had found behind the stable, with the regular dedication of a child who has decided that providing gifts is his primary function. Ellen received them all with a gravity that was entirely unconscious and entirely hilarious, and Clara and Elias watched these transactions from across the room with the private amusement of parents who were trying not to let the children see them laughing. In the spring of 1877, a family named Brewster settled on a piece of land 2 miles below the Cade homestead, a husband and wife and 3 children who had come from Missouri and were attempting to make something of the hill country. Their name was Daniel and Margaret Brewster, and they arrived with a wagon that had lost a wheel coming up the mountain road, and Elias heard about it through a valley rider and went down to help fix it, and came back that evening with the Brewster family in tow because the wagon wasn't ready and the children needed feeding. Clara had supper on the table for 8 people an hour later, which was not a thing she considered impressive, because she had been feeding various numbers of people in this kitchen for 4 years, and simply calibrated accordingly. Margaret Brewster, who was a thin, tired woman who had been traveling for 3 months, sat at Clara's kitchen table and ate, and then looked at the cabin around her with an expression of careful envy that was not unpleasant but was very honest, and she said to Clara, "You've made it very beautiful." "We built most of it together," Clara said, meaning herself and Elias at the other end of the table, telling Daniel Brewster about the best timber stands on the lower slope, heard it and looked across at her. And something passed between them that was visible enough that Margaret Brewster noticed it and looked down at her plate with a small private smile. The Brewsters became neighbors in the full sense, not close enough to see each other daily, but close enough to matter. Daniel was a capable enough farmer, but he had not built for a mountain winter before, and Elias spent considerable time in the autumn of that year helping him prepare the new homestead for what was coming. And Clara helped Margaret put up preserves and dry vegetables with the efficiency of experience. When the first real storm of the winter came down off the mountain in November, the Brewster place was ready for it, and that had everything to do with the Cades. Clara wrote to Ruth regularly through all these years. The pass writer who came twice monthly was reliable, and the correspondence was the thread that kept her connected to Sweetwater Creek and the life she had left there. Ruth's letters were long and full of detail. The town's growth, the Hollis family who had eventually recovered their land when Gerald Potts's legal situation was resolved, the new school teacher who had arrived and caused a considerable amount of quiet excitement among the unmarried men of the county. In the letter that arrived in March of 1878, Ruth mentioned in a careful paragraph that she had heard from a cousin in San Antonio that Doyle Ferris had gotten himself into serious trouble over a land dispute north of the city, which had resulted in his spending a substantial period of time thinking about his choices in the county jail. Clara read this paragraph aloud to Elias, who said, and did not appear particularly surprised, and Clara folded the letter back up with the satisfaction of a woman who no longer needed the world to be fair, but was quietly pleased when it edged in that direction. On a morning in June of 1878, when the mountain was at its most extravagant, the grasses tall and the wildflowers running up the hillsides in rivers of color, and the view from the cabin porch spreading out over the basin in a clarity that made the horizon seem unreasonably far away. Clara was in the garden, and Elias was on the porch with Samuel, who was 5 years old and learning to whittle from a block of cedar with a small knife, and Ellen, who was 2, was sitting in the dirt beside the porch steps with a collection of pebbles she was sorting by a system of her own devising. Clara straightened from the row of beans she was staking and looked at her family on the porch and in the dirt, in the morning mountain light, and she stood still for a long moment with her hands at her sides. She'd been thinking in the past few weeks about something she wanted to say to Elias, and she'd been choosing the moment with the care she brought to important things. She thought this might be the right moment. She came out of the garden and walked to the porch, and Elias looked up from Samuel's lesson and saw something in her face and said, "Samuel, go take that knife work over to the stump." And Samuel went without argument because he had learned to read the particular quality of his father's attention fairly well for a 5-year-old. Clara sat in her chair on the porch and looked at Elias, and the morning was warm, and the view was enormous, and the children were 30 feet away and audible and well, and she said, "I want you to know something." "All right," he said. "I was thinking about the morning I told you yes," she said, "in the livery yard. And I was thinking about how I told you I had been asking the wrong question, whether I could trust you, instead of whether I was brave enough to choose again." "I remember," he said. "I want to tell you that it wasn't bravery," she said. "It turned out to be the easiest decision I ever made. I didn't know it then, but I know it now." He was quiet for a moment. The mountains spread out below them. Ellen's voice drifted up from the steps, narrating her pebble-sorting operation in a low, continuous commentary. "You were the best reason I ever had to come down off this mountain," he said. "I didn't know that the first time I rode down to Sweetwater Creek, and I didn't know it the second or the third. And then one day, I knew it and couldn't unknow it." She looked at him, at the lines of his face, familiar now in every light, every mood, every weather, and she said, "When you walked into that saloon and bought out my debt before you had spoken 10 words to me, I thought you were either a saint or a fool." He smiled, the full smile, the one she had first wanted to see on the night he asked her to supper and had been seeing for 4 years now without it becoming ordinary. "And," he said. "Neither," she said. "You were just a man who had decided, and I have spent every day since grateful that you are the kind of man who decides and does not wait." He reached across and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch in the June morning with the mountain below them and the children nearby, and the years already making themselves into something she would spend the rest of her life being glad of. The summer of 1878 was a good summer by any measure. The garden was productive beyond anything Clara had managed before. The new lower meadow that Elias had cleared produced a strong first haycut, and the trapping season's furs, when they came down in the spring of 1879, fetched the best prices the trading post had offered in years. The cabin had been expanded by then. A new room added on the east end in the winter of 1877, which had become Clara's study of sorts, a small room with a good window and a writing desk, where she kept the garden records and wrote her letters and, increasingly, kept a different kind of record, the observations she had begun making about the mountain country itself, the seasonal patterns and the plant varieties, and the animal behavior, written in the careful, precise style of a woman who had always been a meticulous thinker and had found in the Guadalupe a subject worthy of genuine study. She showed the records to no one initially. They were a private thing, done for the pleasure of doing it. But when a man from the Texas State Geological Survey came through the hill country in the autumn of 1879, making inquiries of the people who had lived longest in the area about conditions and observations, Elias sent him to Clara without telling her he was going to, and the man spent 2 hours at her kitchen table going through her records with an expression of increasing interest, and left with permission to copy several passages for inclusion in a survey report, and the observation that her documentation was some of the most systematic he had encountered from a private individual in the region. Clara watched him ride away down the mountain road and stood in the dooryard for a long moment, and then she came inside and found Elias at the kitchen table with his coffee, looking entirely too calm. "You sent him to me," she said. "He asked who knew the country best," Elias said. "Elias." "I told him the honest answer," he said, and took a drink of his coffee with an expression of complete innocence that was not even slightly convincing. She sat down across from him and looked at him. He looked back. The corner of his mouth was doing the thing it did. "Thank you," she said eventually. "The records are good, Clara," he said, the lightness going out of his voice, something plain and genuine coming into it. "They're worth something. You're worth something. And I don't mean to the survey." She reached across the table and took both his hands in hers and held them, and they sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light with the fire burning low and the children's voices coming from the back room. And she thought about the woman she had been in the Red Bluff Saloon, wiping glasses with a cloth that had seen better days, working her way down a ledger that kept growing. That woman had not disappeared. She was still here, in the same body, with the same practical hands and the same direct eyes. She had just been given back to herself. The years were good. There were hard winters. The winter of 1880 was brutal even by mountain standards, locking them in for 3 weeks with snow that came to the eaves of the cabin and temperatures that made the water in the spring box freeze twice, despite the insulation. Elias had laid in stores for exactly this possibility, and they were comfortable throughout it, but the isolation was total, and they had only themselves and the children and the books and the fire and the long, complicated conversations that a long winter enforces on people who are genuinely interested in each other. They emerged from that winter closer than they had been going into it, which was something. In the spring of 1881, Clara told Elias at the kitchen table, in the same direct way she had the first 2 times, that they were expecting a 3rd child. He received this information in the same way he had received the previous 2, with the helpless, open joy of a man who has never entirely gotten used to the fact that his life has turned out this far on the right side of what he deserved. And he went out into the spring morning afterward and stood in the dooryard for a long time, looking at the mountains, and Clara watched him from the window and understood that he was talking, internally, to his father, as he sometimes did when something large happened. The 3rd child was born in November of 1881. Another son, born in a second morning birth, attended this time by Margaret Brewster, who had learned midwifery in Missouri, and was considered by the Valley settlements to be perfectly capable in the role. He was a large baby, and a serene one, arriving with the unhurried quality of a child who had decided on his own schedule and was not particularly interested in anyone else's timeline. They named him Daniel, not for the Brewster neighbor, though that was not lost on anyone, but for Clara's father, whose name she had been carrying quietly for years, waiting for the right moment to place it. Daniel Cade was, from very early on, his father's particular companion. Where Samuel had Clara's quickness and analytical instinct, and Ellen had some combination of both parents' steadiness and patience, Daniel had the unhurried attentiveness to the physical world that characterized everything Elias did. He watched how things worked. He tried to fix things before he was old enough to fix things. He sat for long minutes watching a beetle cross a stone or a hawk riding a thermal with the focused patience of a born naturalist. By the time he was 3, he was following Elias around the homestead with the dedicated seriousness of a small apprentice, and Elias taught him things, the names of trees and tracks and weather signs, with the same unhurried patience his own father had used, passing knowledge forward through the chain of the generations as if it were something precious and necessary, which it was. Samuel, by 1884, was 11 years old and had been riding down to the Valley Settlement School 3 days a week for 2 years because Clara had insisted on it with the conviction of a woman who understood that education was not optional. He was a strong reader, better at mathematics than his age suggested he should be, and he had Clara's habit of asking questions until he had a complete answer. He rode the trail down to the settlement and back with the confident ease of a child who has grown up on mountain horses, and he was known in the settlement as the Cade boy, which carried a certain weight because his father was known and respected throughout the hill country in the way that very capable and very reliable men tend to be known. Ellen, at 8, was beginning to show an interest in the garden that mirrored Clara's own at that age, a true interest, not the polite participation of a child being helpful, but the genuine curiosity of someone who is beginning to understand systems and wants to understand them better. She asked about soil and seasons and the relationship between the plants and the insects and the water, and Clara answered her with the same completeness she applied to everything, and sometimes they spent whole mornings in the garden together with Clara explaining and Ellen listening and questioning with an intensity that Clara found both familiar and deeply gratifying. In the late summer of 1884, Clara and Elias rode down to Sweetwater Creek together for what had become the annual fall run, leaving the children with Margaret Brewster for the 3 days they would be away. It was the first time in a while that they had made the trip alone together, without the children, and the ride down the mountain through the early September gold was something that had the quality of the very beginning of things, just the two of them and the horses and the long, easy country. Sweetwater Creek had grown in 11 years. The main street had new buildings at both ends. A proper bank had opened in 1880. The school that had been a single room when Clara lived there was now a 2-room affair, and the hotel had been expanded to twice its original size. The Red Bluff Saloon, under John Parrish's management, had become something approaching a respectable establishment, still a saloon, still serving purposes that a saloon served, but without the predatory character that Gerald Potts had given it. Ruth and Ben Calloway's store was still the anchor of the main street, and Ruth herself, though grayer now and somewhat slower on the steps, was still the person most likely to know what was happening in any corner of the county before anyone else did. She embraced Clara in the store doorway with the same thoroughness as always, and held her at arm's length and looked at her face. "You look well," Ruth said. "I am well," Clara said, and the simplicity of it, the fact that it was completely and straightforwardly true, was something she did not take for granted. Reverend Hale had retired the previous year, and the new minister was a younger man named Foster, who did not yet have Hale's seasoned quality but was working on it. Hector still poured drinks at the Red Bluff, older and slower but still sharp, and he recognized Clara immediately and said, "Mrs. Cade," with a warmth that surprised her slightly, and she said, "Hello, Hector," and he said, "That man of yours did a fine thing in here 11 years ago." And she said, "He did," and meant it in more ways than she could have explained. That evening, in the hotel dining room, the same dining room where Elias had asked her what she had said yes to, they ate supper together at a table by the window, and the room was noisier and more crowded than it had been in 1873. And outside the window, the main street of Sweetwater Creek moved with the energy of a town that had survived and grown. And Clara looked at it, and then looked at Elias, and thought about the first time she had sat across from him in this room, watching his hands around his coffee cup, trying to decide if he was a saint or a fool. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "The first night we had supper here," she said. "I was terrified," he said. She looked at him. "You were not," she said. "I was," he said. "I'd been planning that conversation for 2 years, and when I was actually sitting across from you, I was aware that I could lose it in a single wrong sentence." She laughed, the full, genuine laugh that she had first given him at Ruth's table, and that still, after 11 years and 3 children and all the accumulated weight of a shared life, had the same effect on him that it had always had. "You did not lose it," she said. "No," he said, "I didn't." He reached across the table and took her hand the way he had on the porch that June morning, and he held it, and the candle on the table threw its light across both their faces. "That day in the saloon," he said. I walked in there not knowing why I was going to do it. I had the gold dust, and I had the intention, and I wasn't sure I could put a clean reason to it beyond that I had watched you long enough to know that what was happening to you was wrong. And then you asked me to marry you, she said, in the same afternoon. I did, he said. Which was forward, she said. Considerably, he agreed, but I was done with being cautious about it. I'm glad you were, she said, and she was not talking only about the afternoon in the saloon. She was talking about all of it, the whole long arc of it, from the ledger page on the bar of the Red Bluff to the cabin on the mountain with the 2 chairs on the porch and the spring box and the garden and the children and the years. He understood that, because he always understood what she was actually saying. He squeezed her hand. So am I, he said. They rode back up the mountain the next morning, into the September blue of the Guadalupes, the pack mule loaded with supplies, and the 2 of them riding easy and unhurried in the early light, and the mountain rose before them as it always did, large and permanent, and full of the particular beauty of a place that has come to mean home in the deepest possible sense of the word. At the ridge above the lower valley, where the trail crested and the view opened up, and you could see the cabin sitting on its shelf of land with the chimney smoke beginning to thread up into the morning air, Clara stopped her horse and looked at it. Elias stopped beside her and looked where she was looking. From this distance, on a September morning in 1884, the homestead looked like something from a painting. The stone and timber cabin, the expanded garden on the slope below it, the stable and the hay meadow, the spring box wall, the big pines at the back standing dark against the pale rock of the mountain above. And on the porch, 2 small figures, Ellen and Daniel, who had been left with Margaret and who had apparently spotted their parents' horses from a distance and come out to watch. The small figures waved. Clara raised her hand and waved back, and beside her Elias did the same, and she looked at him in the morning light, at the lines of his face, and the gray that had come into his dark hair at the temples over the years, and the steady, absolute quality of his gray eyes, and she felt the whole accumulated weight of the life they had built together settle around her like something made to fit. "Come on," he said, and touched his heels to the black horse's sides. She followed him down the trail toward home, and the mountain held them the way it always did, solid and indifferent and magnificent in theirs, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight and clear in the still September air, and the children on the porch were getting louder now, calling names, because Samuel must have come around from the back of the stable where he had presumably been with the horses, and the 3 of them together made a sound that carried down the hillside like the best kind of music. The years continued to move through the Guadalupes with their mountain weight and mountain beauty, and the Cade homestead grew and solidified into something that was not just a place to live, but a place that had character. The kind of homestead that people who passed through the hill country mentioned to each other and remembered. Clara's garden became known well beyond the valley settlements, and the observations she kept in her study were eventually gathered into a longer document that she sent, carefully copied, to a professor of natural sciences at the University of Texas in Austin, who wrote back with an interest and a respect that Ruth, when Clara forwarded the letter to her for safekeeping, called entirely appropriate and long overdue. Elias, in those years, became something that the hill country produced rarely and valued highly, a man who was known as completely trustworthy, not in the narrow legal sense, but in the full human sense. When the valley settlements had disputes about land boundaries or water rights, it was Elias Cade who was asked to come and look at the evidence and give an opinion, because his reputation for seeing things clearly and saying what he saw without adjustment for anyone's preferences had become a kind of local institution. He did this without ceremony and without payment, because it was simply the kind of man he was. Samuel, at 18, was the image of his father in size and build and the quiet steadiness of his manner, but with Clara's green hazel eyes and Clara's habit of reading everything available and asking about what he had read. He had finished the Valley School at 16, and since then had been apprenticed, at his own request, to a land surveyor in the nearest large town, riding the 2-day journey twice a month to learn the trade with the same focused commitment he had shown everything since childhood. He was going to be good at it. Everyone who knew him understood that, and when he talked about eventually having his own surveying practice in the region, it was with the calm specificity of a person who has decided on a direction and is already walking it. Ellen, at 15, was becoming someone worth watching, serious-minded and observant in the way that Clara had been at that age, and increasingly interested not just in the garden, but in the wider natural world of the mountain country. She and Clara spent hours in the evenings talking about plants and soil and the relationship between the mountain ecology and the settlement patterns below, and the conversations they had were not mother teaching daughter, but two interested minds working through ideas together, which Clara found to be one of the great unexpected gifts of the life she had made. Daniel, at 12, had settled into his nature as his father's apprentice in the deepest sense, not just in the practical skills, though he had those in abundance, but in the philosophical quality of his attention to the physical world. He was going to be a person who understood places the way his father understood them, from the inside out, with love and knowledge indistinguishable from each other. In the spring of 1893, Clara and Elias sat on the porch of the cabin on a warm April evening, the basin below them turning pink and gold in the late light, and they were alone in the way they were often alone now that the children were older, and the homestead ran with a competence that didn't require constant management. Samuel was in town. Ellen was at the Brewster homestead visiting Margaret's daughter, who had become her closest friend. Daniel was somewhere on the lower slope with a notebook and a pocket full of specimens. They sat with their coffee and the view and the companionable silence that had become one of the fixtures of their life together. Not absence of communication, but the fullest kind of it, the silence of two people who have said enough to each other over enough years that the quiet between them carries weight. "Do you remember," Clara said, "what you said to me that first night at supper?" "Most of it," he said. "You said you had thought about me for 2 years in the mountains," she said. "I did," he said. "I want you to know," she said, "that I have thought about what you said every day since, not the fact of it, the way you said it, plainly, without dressing it up." She turned to look at him. "You have never dressed anything up, not once." "It didn't seem useful," he said. "No," she said. "It was not useful. It was essential." She paused. "I have thought about what my life would have been if you had not walked into that saloon, if you had decided to wait another season or to let it be someone else's concern." "I could not have let it be someone else's concern," he said. "Not by that point." "I know," she said, "but I want you to understand what it meant, not just the debt. Anyone with $300 could have cleared the debt. What it meant was that someone walked into a room and looked at me and saw something worth walking toward." She paused again, and her voice was very quiet and very clear. "After 2 years of feeling like nothing but a number in someone's ledger, that was everything." He set down his coffee cup and looked at her, at the face he'd been looking at for 20 years, the hair now threaded with silver at the temples, the green hazel eyes unchanged, the direct and unflinching quality of her gaze that had been the first thing he loved about her without knowing it was love. He said, "I walked into that saloon to buy supplies." She looked at him. "I had not planned any of it," he said. "I saw you standing there, and something in me simply decided, before I had thought it through, before I had considered whether it was presumptuous or forward, or whether you might say no." He paused. "I'm not a man who acts without thinking. But that morning I acted before I thought, and I have not once in 20 years found reason to regret it." She reached over and took his hand, and he held hers the way he always had, firmly, carefully, like something valuable. "Neither have I," she said. Below them, the basin was going dark, the day laying itself down in bands of rose and violet, and the first stars were starting in the east, and from somewhere on the lower slope they could hear Daniel's footsteps on the trail coming home, and the smoke was beginning to rise from the chimney where Clara had set a pot before she came to the porch, and the horses moved in the stable in the evening quiet. The mountain held them, as it had always held them, the stone cabin and the spring box and the garden on the slope, and the 2 chairs on the porch that he had put there 4 years before she arrived, when he had not known quite what he was preparing for, but had prepared for it anyway, because that was the kind of man he was. Samuel rode in 2 days later, and they had supper, all of them together around the big kitchen table that Elias had built in the 2nd year of their marriage, when the original one proved insufficient for the family they were becoming. Samuel was talking about a survey contract north of the mountains that would take him out of the region for 2 months, And Ellen was asking questions about the geology of the country up there with the interest of someone who had been reading about it, and Daniel was listening to all of it with his characteristic focused quiet. And Elias sat at the head of the table, and Clara sat at the other end. And between them, the conversation moved, and the food was eaten, and the coffee went around, and the evening burned down into the comfortable embers of a day well lived. Clara looked down the length of the table at Elias, and he was already looking at her. He often was, in the way that people who have looked at each other across rooms and tables in years develop a private frequency of attention. And she thought about the mountain man who had walked into the Red Bluff Saloon in Sweetwater Creek on a Tuesday morning in October of 1873 with $300 in gold dust and a decision already made. She had spent 20 years learning what that decision had been in all its dimensions. It had been a decision about justice, about looking at a wrong and refusing to walk past it. It had been a decision about honesty, about saying what he meant and meaning what he said, from that first evening to every evening since. It had been a decision about courage, the quiet domestic courage of choosing to let someone know you fully and allowing yourself to be known. And it had been, she understood now with the complete clarity that only 20 years of shared living can provide, a decision about love, made before he had words for it, before he could have known its shape, made from the part of a person that decides before the mind catches up, the part that looks across a room and recognizes something it has been looking for without knowing it was looking. The supper went on, and the children talked, and the night was warm for April, and outside, the mountain stood in the dark as it always had and always would. And the cabin was full of the sounds of a life that had been built by two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other through seasons and storms and the long accumulation of days, and would go on choosing each other for all the days that remained. It was, Clara thought, exactly enough. It was, in every possible respect, more than enough. It was everything.